Benvenute e benvenuti. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our annual prestigious appointment with the Graduate Symposium in Italian Renaissance Art. I am Sasha Perugini, serving as the director of the Syracuse University abroad in Florence since 2011. Today's event is one of the highlights of our academic calendar, a rooted tradition that was introduced as standard practice of the master's program in 1987. Our master's program, however, is much older than that, having been launched in 1964, just 5 years after Syracuse University started its operation here in the Villa Rossa in 1959. I'm thrilled to announce that we will be celebrating the 60th anniversary of the program next year. We are immensely proud of the program's distinguished history and international reputation, and it is my true pleasure to welcome you all here today. And by all, I also mean those who are joining us virtually as we're live streaming and recording this event. It is always a nourishing learning experience to listen to our graduates share their hard-won results of their extensive research. Our master's program is renowned not only for the first-hand investigations concluded by our students in local archives, libraries, museums, and churches, but also for the impressive training they receive on how to communicate their findings most effectively to both general and specialized public. The strength and quality of this program is a credit to the talented scholars guiding the students in their research and symposium preparation, and who will be introduced individually shortly. They're closely operating under the enthusiastic guidance of Dr. Sally Cornelissen, Professor of Art History at our main campus in Syracuse and Director of the Florence Master Program since 2015, and Professor Molly Bourne, the program's Florence Coordinator since 2012. Over the decades, many of the graduate students in the master program have been accepted into top-tier PhD programs and have gone on to have distinguished academic careers in art history. Others have pursued advanced degrees in archival history. Others have pursued advanced degrees in archival history, research, library science, or museum studies. Some of them now have tenured teaching appointments here with us or lead academic site visits for our students. Very often, this alumni return to Florence to visit their professors and their peers who have remained here and are working at cultural institutions throughout the city. These accomplished graduates not only enhance the prestige of our program, but also play a pivotal role in disseminating awareness about the richness of Italian culture and art history on a broader scale. Their endeavors transcend the boundaries of academia, becoming ambassadors who carry the legacy of our program into various spheres. Through their scholarly pursuit and achievements, they contribute significantly to the broader discourse surrounding Italian culture, leaving an indelible mark on the global appreciation of art history. We're proud to witness not just the academic success of our graduates, but also their ongoing dedication to promoting the cultural treasures that Italy holds. All of this is a testament to the rigor and success of this program, and this annual event serves us as a reminder of our commitment to excellence. So thank you all for joining us. I have no doubt you will enjoy this morning talks, and I would like now to pass the podium to Assessora Elisabetta Meucci, who is here in representation of the mayor and the city of Florence. Thank you for joining us, Assessora.
Buongiorno, io ti ringrazio molto, Sasha, per l'invito, perché io sono veramente felice e sono anche onorata di essere qui a portare il saluto del sindaco Nardella e di tutta l'amministrazione comunale a questo simposio. Un evento molto importante, certo molto importante per la Syracuse, che in questo modo conferma l'eccellenza dei suoi programmi, ma direi anche molto interessante, molto significativo anche per la città di Firenze. Per questo sono qui, proprio perché il rilievo che ha per la città di Firenze si può sintetizzare in due aspetti. Il primo, perché questo percorso formativo si svolge su temi molto specialistici che riguardano la storia dell'arte del Rinascimento e quindi riguardano il patrimonio della città di Firenze. E poi perché questa formazione, questo percorso è rivolto non a studenti ma a studiosi, è rivolto a persone già esperte, persone che quando torneranno nel loro paese potranno diventare docenti di storia dell'arte e dunque potranno diventare i nostri eccellenti ambasciatori, i nostri ambasciatori speciali che diffonderanno la conoscenza del nostro immenso patrimonio culturale, storico e artistico nel mondo. E quindi per questo la città di Firenze vi ringrazia molto e vi augura una buona giornata di lavori.
I will not attempt at translating everything she said, but in short, she extended the pride of the city for this program and how you all become ambassadors of Italian culture and Renaissance. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Now, my true pleasure to introduce the real captain of the show, Professor Sally Cornelissen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Good morning. And on behalf of Syracuse University's Chancellor, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and my colleagues in the Department of Art and Music Histories, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 37th Annual Florence Graduate Symposium, the capstone event of the Syracuse Florence Graduate Program in Italian Renaissance Art. The allure of success and longevity of our unique program lie in its structure, the exceptional caliber of our faculty and students, and the very special opportunity it offers to earn a master's degree in art history with an extended residency in Italy. Our program's focus is early modern Italian art and architecture, but we encourage our students to think broadly about the period and the discipline of art history. They engage with the history and practice of art conservation, art historical theories, methods, and historiography, the collection and display of art, the digital humanities, and the ways in which the visual culture of the period relates to the larger Mediterranean and global historical and artistic contexts. These days, educators rightly stress the need for and benefits of hands-on experiential learning, but that's nothing new to us, as experiential learning has been the cornerstone of our program since its foundation in 1964. And as Sasha said, next year we celebrate our 60th anniversary on both sides of the Atlantic, so stay tuned for further information about those events. I'd now like to take the opportunity to thank the graduate faculty, beginning with Molly Bourne, the Florence coordinator, who, like me, is an alumna of the program. Brian Breggy, Sam Johnson, and I taught them during their first semester on the main campus in Syracuse. After they transferred to Florence at the beginning of this year, they continued their coursework with Molly Bourne, Jonathan Nelson, Matteo Duni, who unfortunately can't join us today, hopefully is watching online. We miss you, Matteo. Diane Kunzelman, also an alumna, Ezio Buzzegoli, and Sean Nelson, who is another alumnus. Under their expert guidance, our students engage with leading scholars, museum curators, and works of art and architecture. They learn how to craft gold ground panel paintings, apply plaster and paint to a wall to produce a fresco, handle and transcribe archival documents, conduct original research, and, as you'll see today, prepare and deliver professional presentations. I have every confidence that the students whose papers you will hear today will follow in the footsteps of our many successful alumni. The latter include Anne Proctor of the class of 2005, who holds the positions of Associate Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Education, and Associate Professor of Art and Architectural History at Roger Williams University. And Jane Zaloga, who's also joining us online, of the class of 1994, who's an exemplary teacher and has been a mainstay of the Syracuse Florence's art history faculty for decades. This program transforms the lives, and not just the intellectual lives of those who participate in it. Our students strengthen their foreign language skills and cultural literacy, develop self-sufficiency, and forge the kind of personal and professional creativity and resiliency that lasts a lifetime. It is crucial that we in the university continue to safeguard the rare and special opportunities it offers at a time in which the value of humanities programs is constantly questioned. We've long benefited from the support of Syracuse University's College of Arts and Sciences, Syracuse Abroad, Syracuse Florence, and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. Among the generous individual donors who sustain us, I'd like to single out Andrew Razinen, an SU alumnus who studied on the Florence program, as an undergraduate and who's here with us today, as well as Carol Bullard, Peter Weller, Mary Gilbert Palmer, Barry Katz, and Jill Carrington. I extend a heartfelt thanks to them and everyone else who has supported our program with large and small donations. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Molly Bourne. After completing the Syracuse Florence graduate program in 1988, Molly earned a PhD in art history at Harvard University. Since taking over as Florence graduate coordinator in 2012, she's guided multiple cohorts of talented students to this capstone event in their graduate careers, maintaining the highest of professional and academic standards with both warmth and compassion. This year is no exception. Please welcome Molly Bourne.
Thank you, Sally. Good morning and welcome. We are delighted you have joined us for the 37th Florence Graduate Symposium in Italian Renaissance Art, whether you are with us at the Villa Rosa or watching from afar by the live broadcast. Before introducing our first speaker, a few brief announcements. The first is for those who are physically here, please check that your telephones are turned off or silenced. And second, I want to thank the many staff members here at the Villa Rosa who worked behind the scenes to ensure the smooth operation of this annual event. Without their assistance with event promotion, technical support, and even the refreshments that those of us here today will enjoy, this event wouldn't be possible. I join Sally in expressing my gratitude to my graduate faculty colleagues here in Florence, Matteo Duni, Ezio Buzzeguli, Diane Kunzelman, Jonathan Nelson, and Sean Nelson, who have taught and mentored this group with such dedication over the past year, guiding them to this capstone moment of our program. But the true stars of today's symposium are the 6 master's candidates who will be presenting their research. Today is your day. Before arriving to the Villa Rosa last January, as you heard from Sally, they completed a first semester of coursework in the fall of 2022 at our main campus in New York. During their subsequent year of residency in Florence, they took 7 graduate seminars while being introduced to the city's most important artistic monuments and repositories of books and documents related to Italian Renaissance art. Many of their classes were held on site here in Florence, in front of original works like these. They met with the senior archivist at the Archivio del Duomo, dell'Opera del Duomo, and had the opportunity to read original documents at the Florentine State Archives for an introductory course in paleography. They learned how to make a fresco using traditional Renaissance materials and techniques, and met with conservator Elizabeth Wicks, an alumna of our program, to discuss her work on Artemisia Gentileschi's painting of Inclination on view now at the Casa Buonarroti. They participated in field trips guided by our faculty members to Pisa, to Mantua, and Rome. This combination of experiences has informed the choice each student made last spring to define their individual capstone project, the research for which they carried out during the following months. Today, our candidates will share the results of their findings in 20-minute presentations that each make an original contribution to the field. After the first 3 presentations, those speakers will return to the podium so that our guests who are here at the Villa Rosa can ask questions. And then we will have a 20-minute coffee break, after which we will reconvene to hear the last 3 presentations, followed by an opportunity to ask those speakers questions at the end. And then we hope everyone here at the Villa Rosa will join us for a celebratory brindisi in the room right behind the screen. Our first speaker is Lydia McKelvey, who will present Ghiberti's story of Rebecca, Women's Agency in the Gates of Paradise. Lydia.
In 15th century Florence, as authors advised women to remain inside the home and obey their husband's will, Lorenzo Ghiberti depicted one woman, Rebecca, standing on a terrace and speaking to God. In his Jacob and Esau panel on the Gates of Paradise, originally located on the outside of the baptistry of Florence, Rebecca gives birth to twins, chooses her younger son over her eldest, and deceives her blind husband. Ghiberti presents Rebecca in a novel way, as a matriarch with an active role in her family. By using a contemporary sacred play about the Jacob and Esau story, Rebecca's unusual agency, as demonstrated in the 15th century, can be linked to social concerns for women and their roles in elite family lineage in Florence. Ghiberti's Jacob and Esau panel depicts a complex Old Testament story about a conflict between brothers over their birthright. Their conflict begins before their birth, as their mother Rebecca speaks to God during her difficult pregnancy and is told that two nations fight within her womb. Ghiberti is the first and only Italian Renaissance artist to depict the scene of Rebecca receiving a prophecy from God. The story continues inside the left-hand arch, where Rebecca has just given birth to twins, the oldest, Esau, who is hairy, and the youngest, Jacob, who is hairless. She looks forward towards the four women gathered outside of her birth chamber. Later on, Esau loses his birthright as eldest son in two separate instances. First, he comes back from a hunt, famished. Jacob demands that Esau sell his birthright to him in exchange for food, and driven by hunger, Esau obliges. Many years afterwards, Isaac is blind and nearing death, and he summons his eldest son and tells him to go hunting so that Esau can give him his blessing over the food, or Isaac can give Esau his blessing over the food, excuse me. Rebecca overhears this and instructs her favorite son, Jacob, to bring her a goat so that she can trick her husband into giving Jacob the blessing instead. Jacob obeys her, fooling his father by following her instructions to use the goat's meat as a substitute meal and covering himself with the goat skin to imitate Esau's hairy skin. Standing behind her favorite son, Rebecca is again present, staring pensively across the panel at the four women gathered outside the scene of her son's birth. The plot works, and Jacob receives the blessing intended for the elder son before Esau can return from the hunt. Though this is not depicted in the panel, this leads to a long period of separation between the two brothers, as Jacob leaves at the urging of his mother to find a bride in another land. Through his marriages to Rachel and Leah, and with two other women, Bilhah and Zilpah, Jacob has 12 sons, fulfilling God's promise to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. This family, the lineage of Abraham, is safely carried into another generation, with the younger brother at the head of the family as God intended, thanks to the intervention of his mother, Rebecca. In his Jacob and Esau relief, Ghiberti depicts Rebecca as an unusually active figure who drives the narrative, and by doing so, emphasizes her role as a matriarch in this lineage. This is part of a significant family theme in the larger work, the Gates of Paradise. Ghiberti's East doors of the baptistry, also known as the Gates of Paradise, were created between 1425 and 1452 and feature Old Testament scenes crafted in gilded bronze relief. The doors were installed on the east side of the baptistry in the honored spot facing the Cathedral of Florence, where processions and important civic and religious events would take place. The design process probably occurred between 1425 and 1437, as documents from workshop visits indicate. The design of the Gates of Paradise likely involved humanistic or theological advisors, although Ghiberti's final design differs significantly from the evidence that survives from early planning stages. Ghiberti's final design comprises of 10 large panels, each of which is dedicated to the story of a major biblical patriarch, including Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the drunkenness of Noah, the sacrifice of Isaac, Jacob and Esau, stories of Joseph, Moses and the 10 Commandments, Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, David and Goliath, and the marriage of Solomon and Sheba. Of these 10 scenes, 5 of the 10 depict a moment of significant familial discord. Families also initiate and end the cycle. Ghiberti's presentation of the Old Testament begins with the first couple and ends with a marriage, after largely following the activities of the lineage of Abraham and the kingdom they would create as God's chosen people. The Jacob and Esau panel is the fifth scene, just above eye level, and represents a middle point in the overarching narrative that was easily discernible by the public audience in the Piazza del Duomo. Stories about family would have been particularly appropriate for this baptistry space, where every child born in Florence was baptized at Ghiberti's time. Within this cycle, Rebecca is one of few significant female figures, alongside Eve in the first panel and the Queen of Sheba in the final panel. The Adam and Eve panel is another example of Ghiberti's unusual composition that emphasizes the creation of Eve in the center of the panel over the creation of Adam or the expulsion from paradise in the left and right corners, respectively. In this composition, the creation story is presented as not just the creation of humankind, but the creation of the world's first family. Ghiberti reinforced this theme with a conspicuous scene change in the final panel. According to earlier designs, this panel was meant to feature the judgment of Solomon, but instead depicts the marriage of Queen Sheba and King Solomon. This choice of final scene results in a much more optimistic ending to a cycle that is otherwise characterized by chaos and violence. The Jacob and Esau panel is mixed into that chaotic middle portion. While Rebecca and Isaac are a married couple, they hardly resemble the images of unity seen in the opening and closing panels of the doors. Rebecca in Ghiberti's panel is presented within her role as a mother, not as a wife, as part of the messy realities of family conflict and lineage struggle present in other panels of the cycle. After expulsion from paradise, Adam and Eve's children, Cain and Abel, begin to showcase family conflict in a dramatic and violent fashion. In Ghiberti's Cain and Abel panel, the line of sparse and rocky terrain leads the eye up to the first murder and a murder between brothers. In the next panel, the drunkenness of Noah, the more famous scene of Noah's Ark is relegated to the background. Instead, Ghiberti foregrounds Noah's conflict with his son, Ham, in a story in which Ham does not show Noah appropriate respect after Noah had become drunk, and as a result, he expels Ham from the family. The Jacob and Esau panel is perhaps most clearly linked to a family theme, with its domestic setting and interwoven depictions of fraternal and paternal relationships. Rebecca's association with family lineage can be seen through her gaze towards the four women across from her in the lower left corner of the panel during the stolen blessing. These women occupy a large portion of the foreground and are exceptionally well crafted. They are rarely discussed, although sometimes described as birth attendants or superfluous classical figures. Amy Block offers the most compelling hypothesis that these women may represent a prophetic vision that Rebecca experiences during the stolen blessing of the four women that Jacob would eventually father children with. Those are Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. Rebecca also gazes at these four women during the birth scene, as she's portrayed behind them with the other women in the foreground. These figures, if they do represent Jacob's future wives, best illustrate Ghiberti's depiction of Rebecca as an active matriarch in the life of her son Jacob, and a pivotal figure in her marital lineage. Ghiberti's focus on family and lineage in the gates of paradise differs significantly from his visual precedent, as he depicts Rebecca as a more active figure in the Jacob and Esau story than Renaissance audiences had seen before. In earlier representations, Rebecca does not move and act in the open as she does in Ghiberti's panel, but rather hides behind a curtain to watch her plan unfold. A typical example of this type of scene can be found in the upper church of St. Francis in Assisi, where two late 13th century fresco scenes depict a scene of a stolen blessing, as Jacob is shown in his hairy disguise feeding his ailing father, and the scene of Esau's return and the discovery of a stolen blessing, as he attempts to present his father with food and is rejected. Rebecca is depicted in both panels. In the first, she pushes back a curtain to reveal her presence in the story at the scene of a stolen blessing. In the scene of the discovery of a stolen blessing, her face is obscured as she turns away from the viewer into a curtain at the right-hand side of the panel. From this point, she ushers her son Jacob out of the room so that he can escape his brother's wrath. This is emblematic of a consistent visual association between Rebecca and curtains that obscure her actions and representations before Ghiberti. In this characterization, Rebecca was understood as a secretive figure rather than an active figure who moves in the open, as Ghiberti would later depict her. Ghiberti's presentation of Rebecca as an active matriarch is remarkably similar to a contemporary sacred play about the Jacob and Esau story. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Dr. Newbegin for generously sending me her transcription of this manuscript. Consideration of this unpublished text can help illuminate Rebecca's remarkable characterization in the panel. The story of Jacob and Esau, recorded in a 15th century manuscript at the National Library of Florence, includes many of the same scenes that Ghiberti depicts. The Jacob and Esau play tells the entire story of Jacob through his initial conflict with Esau, his marriages to Rachel and Leah, and his eventual reconciliation with his brother in 52 stanzas. The authorship and original performance date have not been identified. However, as Dr. Newbegin has argued, it most likely debuted during carnival festivities for a confraternity of young boys sometime in the 1450s. It is therefore roughly contemporary to the Gates of Paradise's original installation. Rebecca's activity in the sacred play manuscript is distinctly paralleled by her active characterization in Ghiberti's Jacob and Esau panel. Rebecca enters the sacred play in stanza 6, after Isaac has sent Esau to hunt. Rebecca overhears this interaction and brings her son aside to instruct him to deceive his father. Jacob is hesitant, however, and expresses to his mother that he's afraid that Isaac will discover the trick and curse him instead of bless him. Rebecca scolds him for his cowardice, saying, "I find you too timid, son. I will make it well, and he will not find out. With me, all will go well, my beloved son. I know that this is the will of God." The same tension and emotions of the scene, as well as the reference to divine knowledge, can be seen with the figures of Rebecca and Jacob in Ghiberti's interpretation of the story. In the right-hand interior arch, where Rebecca is shown talking to her son, she visibly speaks as she leans towards Jacob. Jacob looks hesitant in return, protecting the goatskin that she reaches for. Rebecca forcefully points up, towards the scene in which she speaks to God. Like in the play, she explicitly expresses that she has authority in the circumstance due to her divine knowledge. These parallel interpretations center Rebecca as a mother and active matriarch in the family, reflecting contemporary interests in women's roles within lineage in 15th century Florence. Lineage at this time in Florence was most often discussed in relation to inheritance, especially regarding which children deserved patrimony after their father's death. By Ghiberti's time, these inheritance issues were the beginnings of a crisis that would peak in the early 16th century, as the practice of awarding patrimony to only the eldest son resulted in increasing scores of disinherited sons and daughters entering the church. However, it is important to note that the inheritance that Jacob steals from his brother in the story is not a physical inheritance, but rather intangible concepts, a birthright and a blessing from their father. What Jacob is inheriting over Esau in the story is not property, but the right by birth to be the new patriarch of his lineage. Therefore, this story can be better understood by 15th century ideas of the importance of passing one's virtues to the next generation through children. Leon Battista Alberti argues this idea in his influential book about family life, when he describes the purpose of marriage for a man as, first, an occasion to perpetuate himself and his children, and second, to have a steady and constant companion all of his life. This perpetuation of oneself through children, ideally, would involve the new matriarch of the family. While women could not typically inherit title or property from their birth families, once married, they were expected to fully participate in the furthering of their marital lineage. In addition to giving birth to heirs and overseeing their early education, they also had responsibilities for setting up the next generations for success through marriage matches for their children. Alberti describes matrons' unique roles in these matches, especially for their sons, when he advises young men that when, by the urging and counsel of their elders and of the whole family, young men have arrived at the point of marriage, their mothers and other female relatives and friends who have known the maidens of a neighborhood from earliest childhood and know the way that their upbringing has formed them, should select all the well-born and well-brought-up girls and present the list to the new groom-to-be. Extant letters from elite mothers give voice to the large role that many played in their children's marriages. One of the more famous examples of this type is a letter from Lucrezia Tornabuoni, an elite woman and mother of Lorenzo il Magnifico, to her husband Piero de' Medici. In the letter, she describes her impressions of her son Lorenzo's future bride, Clarice Orsini, in great detail after meeting her in Rome. She freely gives her opinions on Orsini's potential compatibility with other members of the family, comparing her to Lorenzo's sisters and assessing her to be worthy of entering this illustrious Florentine family. These kinds of letters, along with Alberti's directions for young men, demonstrate that women's active involvement in lineage making was not only acceptable, but expected within 15th century families when assessing and selecting future brides for their sons. The Jacob and Esau play also references this social reality and makes Rebecca's involvement in Jacob's marriage match explicit. After the stolen blessing, Rebecca has a few lines that initiate the second portion of the play, in which she sends Jacob away to find a suitable bride in another kingdom. Rebecca then gives an aside to Isaac, indicating her true motivations. If Jacob were to find a wife here, I would never be content with her. This line reveals the authority that Rebecca assumes within the play's telling over her son's marriage and the future of their family lineage. As in Ghiberti's panel, the story of Jacob and Esau presents Rebecca as an important matriarch who furthers her marital lineage by helping her younger son to inherit the birthright and to marry well. This joint characterization reflected the role of matrons in 15th century Florentine households within important public concerns surrounding lineage and inheritance in Ghiberti's Florence. Ghiberti transformed Rebecca's story of agency and deception according to God's will into one that was particularly relevant to women's lives and their family roles. Despite the lack of written sources from a culture that valued men's perspectives on women more than women's own voices, Rebecca remains hidden in plain sight and one of the most studied artworks of the Renaissance. Her story and her meaning to 15th century audiences relays some of the intricacies and nuances of women's lives, which are difficult to define some 5 centuries later, but essential in order to understand their world more deeply. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sarah Palomartz, who will present Training Body and Mind, Gesture and Meditation in Perugino's Crucifixion for the Florentine Cistercians. Sarah.
Since 1496, visitors who step into the Cistercian monks' chapter house in the Florentine convent of Santa Maria Maddalena di Cestello come upon a monumental fresco that is generally considered one of Pietro Perugino's major works. Behind the painted architectural framework of 3 arches unfolds a crucifixion scene set in a spacious and peaceful landscape. In the center, Mary Magdalene kneels in prayer at the foot of the cross. In the left arch appear the Virgin Mary and the Cistercian abbot Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, while the right arch shows John the Evangelist and Saint Benedict, author of the monastic rule followed by the Cistercians. All 5 figures are absorbed in contemplation of the crucified Christ, whose image dominates the environment of the monks' daily meeting place. In his mid-16th century biography of the artist, Giorgio Vasari severely criticized the apparent superficiality of religious feeling in Perugino's devotional works. Ever since, scholars have been highly dismissive toward the expressionist body language of the painter's holy figures, likening their gestures to mere appendages or stereotyped features. I will explore Perugino's crucifixion fresco as an effective case study to challenge these prevalent ideas and reconsider the role of hand gestures as the painting's intended audience perceived them. By looking at Perugino's figures through the lens of St. Bernard's writings and Cistercian prescriptive texts, I will argue that his depiction of composed and repetitive gestures of devotion harmonized remarkably well with the 15th century monk's views on body language and its relation to spiritual contemplation. Seen in this new light, Perugino's gestures can be understood as an integral part of a larger pictorial schema that included a second fresco in the chapter room and facilitated the Cestello monks' meditation on the life and death of Christ, a practice I will for the first time connect to the multifunctional space that was the Cistercian monks' chapter house. In November 1493, Dionigi and Giovanna Pucci hired Perugino to paint a crucifix with 5 figures in the Cestello chapter house, a project the artist completed by April 1496. Their commission for the Florentine monastery was part of an important renovation campaign prompted by the recent transfer of the Cistercian monks of Settimo Abbey, located 10 kilometers to the west of Florence, into the Cestello church and convent. A drawing from the mid-16th century provides insight into the layout of the monastic complex as it appeared shortly after the Pucci commission. The chapter house is located along the eastern side of the cloister, where it is flanked by the sacristy on the right and the guest quarters on the left. The square vaulted chamber was accessed through a single entrance opening onto the monks' cloister. Benches probably lined the walls of the room, with the abbot's seat placed in the middle of the eastern end, so just below Perugino's crucifix. The chapter house was one of the most important and private spaces of the Cistercian convents, the place where the monks held their daily communal meeting. They would gather there every morning to settle practical matters related to the life of the monastic community, listen to a reading of a chapter from the Rule of Saint Benedict, recite collective prayers, confess their sins, and be punished in the presence of their fellow brethren. The Ecclesiastica Officia, a 12th century Cistercian book of customs, prescribed facing and bowing eastwards on several occasions during the office of the chapter, which meant facing the abbot, and in the Cestello chapter room, facing Perugino's crucifixion. Since the 12th century, the decorative program of chapter rooms among religious orders in Italy typically consisted of a crucifixion on the wall opposite the entrance, often associated with order-specific images and saints, as in the Dominican convents of Santa Maria Novella and San Marco. The representation of the crucified Christ sanctified the space and function of the chapter room, while the order-specific imagery tied the office of the chapter to that community's customs and identity. At Cestello, a specifically Cistercian image was added to the chapter house program around 10 years after Perugino executed the crucifixion. Painted on the north wall by another artist, this later mural represents Christ lowering himself from the cross to embrace Saint Bernard, an episode known as the amplexus. It was meant to form, alongside Perugino's crucifixion, a visual backdrop for the holy business conducted daily in the monks' chapter room. For the duration of the chapter meeting, the Ecclesiastica Officia prescribed that the monks observe total silence. Like other monastic orders that followed the rule of Benedict, Cistercians cultivated silence as a state conducive to the contemplative life they pursued. In an environment where silence reigned for extended periods of time, gesture and body language took on paramount importance. The movements of the body were a primary concern of the French abbot Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a founding figure of the Cistercian order. In one of his sermons on the Song of Songs, Saint Bernard stated that when the movements of the limbs and senses, its gestures and habits, are seen to be resolute, pure, restrained, free from all presumption and license, then the beauty of the soul will be seen openly. So he believed that a person's inward purity found outward expression in the restraint of movements and gestures. In his important treatise on the steps of humility and pride, Bernard offers examples of transgressive behavior. Curiosity is when a monk begins to roam with his eyes, hold his head erect, prick up his ears wherever he's standing, walking, sitting. The strange movement of the body reveals a new disease in the soul. Mirth is when foolishness appears in his gestures, merriment in his face, vanity in his stride. This type of unacceptable body language, one that was strongly associated with impure thoughts and an impure soul, would be punished with a beating in the chapter house, bringing Cistercian monks who had gone astray back into the fold of religious discipline. In that sense, cultivating restrained gesture was not simply about controlling the body, but about nurturing the soul as well. In the Cestello chapter room, Perugino's model figures with their serene features and restrained gestures provided the Florentine monks with exemplars of virtuous and devout souls, reminding them of the importance of conducting themselves in a composed manner at all times. Their hand gestures denoting prayer and spiritual feeling add a further layer of meaning to their body language. Saint Bernard and Mary Magdalene joined their hands in front of their chests, with open palms placed one against the other and fingers extended. The Virgin's hands are intertwined and held low in front of her womb. The arms of John the Evangelist are extended along his body with palms pointing outwards. And Saint Benedict's hands are crossed one upon the other on his chest. Since the 11th century, the joining of the palms in front of the chest had become the quintessential gesture of Christian prayer, often combined with the kneeling posture, as is the case here. The outstretched arms, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman worship, were associated with the heavenwards gaze to express a feeling of fervent and devoted love for God. The hands with intertwined fingers, a gesture that appears frequently in scenes of the Passion, such as Perugino's lamentation over the dead Christ, denote pain and grief, and by extension also indicate a state of deep meditation on human suffering. The gesture of the arms crossed in front of the chest is a sign of profound humility and submission to God's will, and as such is often assumed by the Virgin in scenes of the Annunciation. The specific meanings of these devotional gestures enhance the Cistercian viewer's understanding of the figure represented. In the Cestello crucifixion, Saints Bernard and Mary Magdalene are the only two saints who enact the same gesture of devotion. Both supposedly experienced visions by virtue of a constant practice of assiduous prayer. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate model of empathy with Christ's suffering. Her tightly clenched hands must have visually reinforced the teachings of Saint Bernard, who strongly encouraged to empathize with Christ's human ordeal through emotive meditation on the Savior's passion. Saint John was considered the most beloved of the 12 apostles, who enjoyed a close proximity and intimate bond with Christ. His extended arms probably resonated with the monks as a reflection of Bernard's conception of the relationship between man and God, which he believed to be founded on love and affectionately described as an embrace or kiss in his sermons. Saint Benedict embodies the supreme monastic virtue of humility, and his posture and gesture of hands crossed on his breast would have reminded the Cistercian beholders of the Benedictine rule recited so often in the chapter house, stating that a monk always manifests humility in his bearing no less than in his heart. For his intended audience, Perugino's set of devotional gestures conjured up different manners of engaging with the divine: faith, empathy, love, and humility. The fresco thus provided a visual catalogue of attitudes the Cestello monks could imitate to effectively condition their bodies for reaching out to God. In the Middle Ages and early modern periods, certain bodily postures were regarded as more appropriate for worship because they prompted the mind to prayer and meditation. St. Augustine, for instance, deemed that gesture rendered prayer more effective because movements of the body intensify the feelings of the heart. Ideas such as these found expression in treatises and handbooks, like On Prayer and Its Characteristics by the French theologian Peter the Chanter, or the anonymous Dominican manual on the manner of praying. Peter the Chanter's conception of praying gestures is almost a technical one. The Christian worshipper needs to know exactly how to position the different parts of his body in the correct way for prayer to be effective. The then current belief was that certain states of soul could be stimulated by using the right gesture and adopting the right bodily posture, which could be mastered by sustained training. Interpreting the Cestello crucifixion as an incentive to prepare the body for the mental exercise of spiritual contemplation calls for a closer look at the time and place of meditation in Cistercian tradition. Thus far, no scholar has attempted to connect Cistercian meditation practices with the actual space where Perugino painted his crucifixion. Close study of the Ecclesiastica Officia reveals that upon exiting the chapter room, the monks were required to sit down to their daily reading of sacred texts, called Lectio Divina. They would stop at the book cupboard, usually located next to the chapter house, on their way to the wing of the cloister gallery reserved for quiet personal reading. While they pondered the words of the scriptures, the Cestello monks could maybe have seen Perugino's crucifixion through the entrance and unglazed windows of the room from their seats in the cloister. When winter made it too cold or dark to read outside, the chapter house was used as an alternative space for reading, where candles would have provided some light. Lectio was one of the four components of the contemplative life, the other three being meditatio, oratio, and contemplatio. These were conceived of as progressive, meaning that the monk would move from reading to meditation, from meditation to prayer, and from prayer to contemplation. The connection between Perugino's crucifixion fresco and the practice of meditation therefore lies in the daily exercise of lectio that would have happened after the office of the chapter, within sight of, or sometimes in, the chapter room, and prepare the monks' minds for meditatio. Some of the pictorial devices in Perugino's crucifixion indeed made the image an effective visual aid to meditation. The crucifixion scene is stripped of its narrative and dramatic qualities and any superfluous ornamentation, and instead focuses on the essentials of the iconography, simplicity and severity being considered conducive to prayer and contemplation. The fictive architectural setting creates the illusion that the outdoor scene is an extension of the chapter room, as if the beholder were looking out from a loggia. Normally, the end wall of Cistercian chapter houses was pierced by 3 windows, which were viewed as a symbolic gateway to God. At Cestello, the east wall features no windows, but it has this tripartite illusionistic arcade that frames an image of the divine in a fictitious outdoor setting. The illusionistic character of Perugino's fresco reinforces the viewer's impression of inhabiting the same space as the holy figures and joining them in contemplation. Furthermore, Perugino has depicted the cross with the crucified Christ almost as if it were a sculpted crucifix, an effect appreciated best when standing in front of the mural and looking up. The 2 wooden beams seem to be pushed up against the edge of the central arch, as if on the verge of entering the world of the spectator. This sculptural rendering of Christ on the cross was perhaps intended to evoke the possibility of the Savior materializing under the gaze of the meditating monk. Perugino could have looked to earlier works of art with similar motifs, such as Masaccio's Trinity fresco in the Church of Santa Maria Novella. Painting and sculpture sometimes work together to create this type of illusion, for example, when a painted scene included a sculpted crucifix. Perugino himself had a hand in such a composite piece in Monte Ripido shortly after completing the Cestello projects. The Florentine Cistercians would have interpreted the fresco of the Amplexus on the north wall of their chapter house as a visual record of a crucifix materializing before the beholder's eyes. The mural is the first known representation of this subject in Italy. It illustrates the moment in which Saint Bernard, absorbed in prayer before a church altar, saw a crucifix miraculously appear above the floor in front of him, and the figure of Christ bend down from the cross to embrace him, an episode that underscored the spiritual rewards of the saint's empathy with Christ's sacrifice. Significantly, as noted briefly by previous scholars, the Cestello amplexus was painted on Bernard's side of the crucifixion and set in a matching landscape rather than the church setting suggested by the written account of the event. In addition, the fresco includes the motif of Adam's skull and bones at the foot of the cross, linking St. Bernard's vision to the site of Christ's passion. The lifeless expression and weighty upper body of the crucified Christ in turn imply a more specific reference to the scene of the deposition. The placement and setting of the Cestello amplexus, as well as its visual connection with the deposition, strongly suggests that artist and patron expected the crucifixion and amplexus frescoes to be seen as a continuous story, beginning with spiritual contemplation and ending with the visionary embrace. The synopia of the amplexus reveals an intriguing change between the stages of underdrawing and painting. In the synopia, St. Bernard's left hand touches Christ's right arm, but in the fresco, the hand has been lowered, giving Bernard a slightly less active role in the embrace. Though the commission of the Cestello amplexus is undocumented, the synopia to fresco change may indicate that the monastic community requested this second image in their chapter house to amplify the message of Perugino's crucifixion in a specific way. What the amplexus brings more explicitly into the chapter room's iconographic program is the question of spiritual vision, suggesting that different degrees of visual perception were already at play in the earlier crucifixion scene. If we follow the analysis offered by Andreas Schumacher of Perugino's vision of St. Bernard, painted for the Nazi chapel in the Cestello church, the footwear could serve as an indication of different levels of reality. In the crucifixion fresco, Bernard and Benedict both wear gray slippers, while the Virgin and St. John are barefoot, implying that the biblical figures are mental images conjured up by the two monks' meditating minds. It has not been previously noted that the Cistercians could have associated these slippers with a passage in the Ecclesiastica Officia specifying that they were allowed to wear their comfortable night slippers instead of their heavy working clogs during the hours of lectio, that monastic activity which was the gate to spiritual contemplation. The restrained and precise gestures in Perugino's Cestello crucifixion and in his devotional works more broadly have emerged as much more than stereotyped appendages. As a mirror of the soul and a channel of communication with the divine, they must have been an integral part of the artist's success with clerical patrons. At Cestello, the poised gesture of devotion are combined with the distilled composition, dreamy landscape, illusionistic architecture, and hovering crucifix to create a visual environment that would have facilitated reaching a meditative state of mind. As such, Perugino's gestures are silent witnesses to a 15th century spirituality that is intently turned inwards. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Emma Leandris, who will present the Padua Parochet as Gateway to Jerusalem, a transcultural textile in early modern Italy. Emma.
Throughout the 16th century, many portable objects arrived in Italy by way of the Mediterranean Sea. A Jewish ceremonial textile known as the Padua Parochet represents a particularly important yet understudied example. The parochet, meaning Torah ark curtain, refers to a curtain used in most synagogues to cover the ark which houses the Torah scroll. Contemporary scholars concur that this parochet was made in Cairo for Italian Jewish consumers sometime during the first half of the 16th century. Yet while recent scholarship almost exclusively focuses on the parochet's origin and style, the meaning of its decorative program and its impact on beholders warrants further investigation. My study offers a new interpretation of the Padua Parochet's iconographic program by concentrating on the textile's gateway motif and the three objects it frames: the menorah, the altar, and the triple crown. I argue that taken together, these objects symbolize the imagined world of biblical Jerusalem. As such, the Parochet communicates a specific message commemorating the Beit HaMikdash, that is, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. This message was readily accessible to 16th century Jewish beholders across the Mediterranean. Through focusing on this specific textile, my aim is to explore how mobile objects reflected the circulation of traditions and ideas, and also to emphasize the role of ceremonial textiles in transmitting and preserving collective memory. The Padua Parochet features three central objects on a rich red background: three connected crowns, a 7-branched menorah with bird-footed legs, and a flaming altar. These objects are framed by an architectural portal, which is surmounted by a horizontal strip bearing a Hebrew inscription. The Parochet's material composition of S-spun wool and its stylistic parallels with Ottoman and Mamluk carpets led Dr. Alberto Borelevi and other contemporary scholars to argue that the Parochet's production date corresponds to a transitional period between the Mamluk and Ottoman rule of Egypt. That is, shortly after the 1517 Ottoman takeover of Cairo. In form and function, the early modern Parochet derives from biblical accounts. Exodus describes the Parochet as a curtain of blue, purple, and crimson yarns and fine twisted linen. The Parochet served as a divider between the two most sacred sections of the Mishkan, or the tabernacle, which was the movable sanctuary of the Israelites and the predecessor of the Beit HaMikdash. As the Beit HaMikdash was modeled after the temple, after the tabernacle, the Parochet of the temple assumed the same role as the Parochet of the tabernacle. After the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the Parochet was given new life. In the diaspora, when the synagogue served as a lesser temple, the Parochet was hung in front of the Torah-bearing ark. The synagogue Parochet therefore maintained the functions of division and protection by demarcating the sacred space which housed the Torah scroll and acting as a separator between the tabernacle of the Torah scroll and the lay space of the prayer hall. The appearance of Parochot varied across geographic regions. Italian and other European curtains were traditionally made of fabrics such as silk, linen, and velvet. Ottoman Parochot, however, were often made of wool. The Padua example therefore reflects the Middle Eastern and North African curtains in materiality. Yet while the fabric of the Padua Parochet echoes that of other Middle Eastern and North African curtains, its architectural framing motif reflects an Italian Renaissance borrowing. This motif, comprising an arch supported by two classicizing columns or pilasters, appeared on early modern Italian Parochot, Torah arcs, and Hebrew printed book title pages. While contemporary scholars often refer to this design as both a gateway and a portal, the key to identifying the Padua curtain's architectural frame with the gateway to the Jewish temple is found in its Hebrew inscription. Composed of 6 words, the inscription represents a verse from Psalms in the Hebrew Bible and reads, Zahashar Ladonai Tzadikim Yavo Uvo. This is the gateway for God, the righteous shall enter through it. These words appear not only on the Padua Parochet, but also on the first known Hebrew printed book with the title page featuring a classically rendered portal. Daniel Bomberg's Rabbinic Bible, which was first printed in Venice in 1517. Both the title page and the Parochet display the verse atop a round arch, identifying the portals on the text and textile with the gateway for God. Biblical commentaries support a reading of the gateway for God as the gateway of Jerusalem. For example, in his exegesis on Psalms 118, verse 20, the renowned medieval scholar Rashi states that the gate for God is the gate of the Beit HaMikdash. Rashi's commentaries were widely known throughout the early modern Mediterranean, and especially in Italy. His commentaries almost always appeared in Hebrew Bibles, including Daniel Bomberg's 1517 Rabbinic Bible. The portals on Bomberg's title page and the Padua Parochet therefore corroborate Rashi's description of the gate of the Jerusalem temple. Scholars have suggested that the title pages of Northern Italian Hebrew books, which feature architectural portals, represent the visual source for the Parochet's gateway motif. However, they did not connect the Parochet's design to the title page of Bomberg's 1517 Rabbinic Bible. Yet this page provides the most convincing visual model for the curtain's frame because of its identical inscription and early date, which corresponds to the Parochet's likely production period. An investigation of this book's architectural frame therefore offers new insights into the relevance of gateway imagery for Jewish textual and textile traditions. At the turn of the 16th century, publishers across Christian Europe began printing decorative title pages. The first title pages with architectural frames appeared in Rome in 1510 and featured a portal with two classical columns. The frame of the 1517 Rabbinic Bible, printed by Bomberg, who was one of the most important printers and publishers of Italian Hebrew books, spurred a trend in the rapidly developing world of Hebrew printing. Throughout the Cinquecento, Jewish and non-Jewish printers of Hebrew books in Venice, Padua, and Mantua produced title pages that resembled ornate versions of Bomberg's models. The meaning of an antique gateway in a Jewish textual context underscores the significance of an architectural title page for an international Jewish audience. The Hebrew term sha'ar carries a double meaning, signifying both title page and gateway. Other Hebrew words which carry architectural and literary significance include amud, book page and column, and bayit, house and stanza. Similar parallels also appear in Aramaic, the other major language of Jewish texts. 3 tractates in the Talmud are called Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, in Aramaic meaning first gate, middle gate, and last gate. These semantic observations point to the recurrence of gateway metaphors in Jewish religious texts. A title page, such as the one reproduced in a rabbinic Bible, must have prompted Jewish scholars to relate what they read and discussed to this idea. The wide geographical reach of Italian Hebrew books, and especially Bomberg's Bibles, was also well known in 16th century circles. The Flemish humanist Nicholas Clenardus describes their circulation in a letter to his teacher by stating, "The Hebrew books which Bomberg prints in Venice are shipped by sea to Jews in all parts of the world, in Africa, Ethiopia, the Indies, Egypt, and to other places where Jews live." Modern scholars examine the role of Italian printing in sustaining the spiritual and cultural life of Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul, Cairo, and other Ottoman centers were desirable markets for Venetian printers. As Ottoman print shops were typically less technically sophisticated than their Italian counterparts, Eastern Mediterranean communities relied on the importation of Hebrew books for synagogues and yeshivot, or places of study. Given that Egyptian Jewish leaders and Venetian printers shared an interest in circulating Italian books in Ottoman Jewish communities, the architectural title pages almost certainly reached 16th century Cairo. Considering the production and distribution of Italian Hebrew books in the Eastern Mediterranean and the relevance of the classical architectural motif for the Jewish publishing tradition, the Padua Parochet's gateway to the Beit HaMikdash probably came from a northern Italian printed book and probably an edition of Bomberg's 1517 Rabbinic Bible. A reading of the Padua Parochet's architectural frame as a gateway to the Jerusalem temple encourages an identification of the three central objects featured on the textile, the menorah, altar, and triple crown, with the Beit HaMikdash's implements and rituals. The menorah, one of the most ancient and widely recognized Jewish symbols, establishes the focal point of the composition. Once a holy implement in the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash, the multi-branched candelabrum took on a new function in the synagogue. Unlike the daily lit menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, the post-temple or the synagogue candelabrum was only used during the celebration of Hanukkah and featured 8 or 9 rather than 7 branches. Thus, the Padua Parochet's 7-branched menorah is a clear reference to the Beit HaMikdash lamp. Its branches further echo the biblical menorah's depiction. Exodus describes the menorah as featuring arms formed of cups shaped like almond blossoms, each with calyx and petals. The branches of the Parochet's menorah, which appear in the form of yellow, blue, and green flowers, reflect the vegetal and plant-like description of this ancient prototype. A 16th century beholder who would see the Parochet during prayer services in the Lesser Temple would have interpreted the menorah as a clear reference to the Beit HaMikdash. Following the destruction of the temple, Torah arcs faced the direction of Jerusalem in nearly all synagogues. As the commemoration of and longing for the ancient sanctuary was also constantly being invoked in liturgical prayers and readings of the Torah scroll, the Parochet's menorah would have created an association with the Jewish temple's rituals. 15th century rabbinic writings suggest that a longing for the Beit HaMikdash, and especially for its 7-branched menorah, formed an important part of a collective Jewish identity. A responsum, that is, a rabbinic legal writing, of one of the most prominent Jewish authorities in northern Italy, Rabbi Yosef Trabato, describes an attempt of community members to commission a temple-like menorah for synagogue use. While unsuccessful, their efforts emphasize the active role the commemoration of the Beit HaMikdash and its implements assumed in Mediterranean Jewish communities. The menorah's unusual bird feet support a reading of the object beneath the lampstand as a representation of a temple altar. Biblical sources attest to the presence of altars in the tabernacle and the temple, one for animal sacrifices and one for the offering of incense. An example, albeit much later, of an altar and a menorah on a ceremonial textile is an 18th century Italian me'il, that is, a Torah mantle or decorative covering placed over the Torah scroll. This textile depicts a menorah and 2 kinds of temple altars. The Parochet's fiery altar, therefore, is likely a representation of one of the temple's altars, either the one for incense located next to the menorah in the temple, or more likely, one for animal sacrifices on which birds were routinely offered. As evoked by the fiery altar, the theme of temple offerings carries special significance for the parochet's function. Throughout the early modern period, Jewish ritual objects were perceived as substitutions for temple sacrifices. The donation of ceremonial textiles by individuals was a common practice throughout all Jewish communities in the early modern Mediterranean. Various synagogue textiles, including parochot, were embroidered with phrases that compare the donations of ritual objects to temple offerings. As the Padua Parochet does not contain any embroidered dedications, but was likely commissioned for synagogue use, the inclusion of a temple altar in its decorative program may have been intended to remind beholders of the parochet's sacrificial function in the absence of the temple. The final decoration inside the architectural frame also refers to the lost temple, albeit a discrete one. Some scholars have identified the detail above the menorah as a keter Torah, or Torah crown. However, a closer look at the configuration of the Padua Parochet's keter yields a different interpretation. 3 suspended crowns with 1 crown at a higher level are connected to form a unified composition. The inspiration for these 3 connected crowns most likely derives from the Talmud, the foundational text of Jewish law. Tractate Yoma discusses a metaphorical set of 3 crowns found in the Beit HaMikdash: the crown of the altar, ark, and table, which correspond to priesthood, Torah, and kingship. Of these 3 crowns, the crown of the ark, or the Torah, was considered superior and the one from which the other 2 derived their power. The appearance of a similar crown configuration in Cinquecento Italian Hebrew texts underscores the relevance of the Talmudic discourse for a parochet in early modern Italy. For example, the visual device of an important Venetian printer of Hebrew books, Alvise Bragadin, features 3 crowns, with 1 crown at a higher level than the other 2. Such a device often appeared in the title pages of his books. The presence of Bragadin's device on a Hebrew text would have undoubtedly prompted a Jewish reader to recall the Jewish temple crowns. The contemporaneous appearance of the connected crowns on the Padua Parochet therefore should not be interpreted as coincidental. Instead, it contributes to a symbolic reading of the decorations inside the gateway as representations of the world of ancient Jerusalem. My study presents the decorations as forming a unified iconographic program. By identifying the parochet's architectural frame as a gateway to the Beit HaMikdash and interpreting the 3 central objects as symbolic reminders of the temple's implements and rituals, I aim to demonstrate this parochet's role in preserving Jewish collective memory. Hanging before the synagogue Torah scroll, the parochet would have evoked feelings of loss and celebration as its beholders commemorated the lost Jewish temple during prayer services. The Padua Parochet represents a conglomeration of influences, inviting technical and stylistic comparisons to texts and textiles throughout Europe and the Ottoman Mediterranean. Yet while this parochet represents a transcultural object, existing between Egypt, where it was made, and Italy, where it was used, it is also a uniquely Jewish production, and as such, should be examined and interpreted within the context of Jewish visual and textual culture in the Mediterranean and beyond. By supporting visual observations with biblical, rabbinic, and linguistic analyses, and especially drawing on 15th and 16th century responsa, my study offers new avenues for future studies into the vibrant world of traveling parochot and other portable Jewish ritual objects. Thank you.
And if I could ask Sarah and Lydia to come up to the front. We have an opportunity to ask questions of the three young scholars who've just presented their work to you, starting with Lydia's paper on the Ghiberti panel, Sarah's on the Perugino fresco, and Emma's on this Padua Parochet. So my colleague Jonathan Nelson has a wireless microphone, and if anyone has a question, I just ask that you raise your hand and he will bring you the mic so that those who are watching remotely can also hear the question.
Thank you. On the Ghiberti, your point made that the gates of paradise, half of them regard family discord.
Mhm.
I'm wondering whether you think that because it was for public, there were some lessons there. You know, there's in Florence and on the Campanile, there's the drunkenness of Noah. There's sort of lessons to be given, and because family and family unity was so important in Florence, socially and commercially.
Yes, I would agree. Thank you for your question. I would agree very much that there were some lessons to be learned in the Gates of Paradise program, and that is part of why family is such a significant, especially family conflict, is such a significant part of the panel's overarching narrative. I would also say that, as you said, family was very important in the Renaissance, but family conflict was also considered to be both a private and a public concern. And that's why we have, you know, books like Alberti's Books of the Family. It's not just because he's so concerned that everyone's happy at home, but because he feels that the stability of the family unit is essential to the stability of the whole community. In terms of the broader program, even outside of those panels that talk about family conflict, there's also a broader through line of this bigger story of God's recurring covenant with his people, generation after generation, even though they have messy rivalries, petty jealousies, they make mistakes, they kill each other, you know, all these, you know, chaotic things. But even so, God is working through these imperfect people towards the greater good of salvation. And I think that's perhaps a message that was very important to the Florentine public at this chaotic time, and also part of a broader purpose of this kind of space. Like it says in the baptistry floor, there's an inscription from 2 centuries earlier about all the beauty that can be seen in Florence, and says, Florence is flourishing and furnished with all good things. So it's part of this idea that art in public space is meant to inspire and aspire public betterment for those audiences.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for a very interesting presentation. And I have a question about Parochet. You mentioned, you mentioned the notions of Jewish collective memory and identity within the Mediterranean in Renaissance. So could you elaborate more on these notions? What were they like?
Thank you, Elisa. So the question is on Jewish collective memory and memory of the temple. So I'd like to start by saying that it's not unique to, you know, the Renaissance period, this notion of remembering the temple. I mean, since the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, we have so much visual culture that's kind of commemorating the temple in Jewish art throughout Europe and the Mediterranean and beyond. But in one example, you can see this is through textual traditions like prayers. So the Jewish central prayer, the Amidah, which is you know, you reference several times a day. This prayer features a lot of discussions on ideas of both loss and celebration, mourning for the temple, but also thinking back to kind of the beauty and splendor that it was. But I would say that with this context in mind, we can really see this this desire and longing and celebration come through during the early modern period through examples in response to the rabbinic legal writings that describe what was happening in Jewish communities of the time. So one response that I had mentioned by Rabbi Yosef Tgabato describes the attempt of 15th century Jewish community members to commission a menorah that matched the exact dimensions of the temple menorah. So you see these community members really trying to kind of bring this temple to life. And I think that this shines through a lot in 15th, 16th century, but of course should be taken within the broader context of the importance of temple memory to Jewish identity in ancient and modern times. Thanks. So based on stylistic and technical observations, the likely production period is the early 16th century. So there's elements of the textile that include Ottoman decorative traditions, for example, the tulips, and certain elements that echo that of Mamluk carpets, which were produced in Cairo up until kind of throughout the 16th century. So we can attribute that to the kind of transitional period. And Dr. Alberto Bogalevi has done so much work on this, and he's here today, so you can talk to him about that as well.
Right, thank you. Can you hear me? So maybe to some extent this may seem obvious because it would have hung in a building oriented towards the former temple, right? But it is also oriented towards the Orient, right? And it's a descriptive program that you've just mentioned, and also in its physical provenance. And I wonder if you would like to situate it a bit more, and whether also it is maybe evident of not just a Jewish, but a broader Italian cultural context that orients towards the Orient.
Great. So the question is on orientation. And I think it's very interesting because we often hear discussions of parallels made with Jerusalem and Florence, especially kind of throughout the Quattrocento. We see also in the kind of great discussions on pseudoscript in Italian Renaissance art by Alexander Nagel and others that discuss the idea of art produced in Italy in the 15th century being kind of oriented, literally looking towards the east, looking towards the Holy Land. So this discourse is very much at play in contemporary Christian context, and I think it also very much so applies to the Jewish context as well. And we can use this as a lens for interpreting other works of Italian Jewish visual culture as well.
I've got a question for Sarah. I was just wondering because as you brought up at the beginning of your talk, Perugino often uses very similar gestures right throughout his oeuvre. And so I was wondering how you might interpret, or should they be interpreted fairly similarly when these gestures appear in works for other orders. For example, his images in the Santissima Nunziata, for example, where there's can be quite similar gestures being performed by the saints.
Yes, so you're interested in the meaning of these same gestures in other artists' works at the same time. Always, so Perugino in his other, yes, so of course the gestures I have described here are sort of standards in the Christian repertoire of devotional gestures. So I'm not arguing for a specifically Cistercian interpretation of these, and Perugino indeed used these gestures throughout commissions for different religious settings or patrons, and I think that shows that the importance of depicting these specific gestures. These gestures were the gestures that provided sort of a physical channel of communication with the divine. It was important that it were those gestures specifically. So they're universal. I mean, universal in the Christian context. And he used them throughout his works in other crucifixions as well. What I propose here is to sort of step back and try to understand how a Cistercian viewer with the baggage they had, how they would have interpreted them, how they would have read them, and how it can sort of enhance our understanding of this specific fresco in this specific context.
We will now hear the final three presentations with an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the last of these three papers. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Alden Ekman, who will present Un cenacolo con sopra tre lunette, Plautilla Nelli's paintings for the refectory of Santa Caterina da Siena in Florence. Alden.
In the mid-16th century, the Dominican nun artist Suor Plautilla Nelli and her nun collaborators painted 3 lunettes for their convent of Santa Caterina da Siena in Florence. These panels, depicting Saint Dominic receiving the rosary, the crucifixion, and Saint Catherine of Siena in prayer, remained in the convent until their removal, separation, and relocation during the Napoleonic suppression of Santa Caterina from 1808 to 1810. Due to their fragmented and poorly documented history, scholars have only recently identified the lunettes as constituting a single cycle. The present study deepens understanding of the lunettes and integrates them into broader discussions on Plautilla Nelli's artistic works. I argue, for the first time, that Nelli's lunettes were displayed above her monumental Last Supper in the convent refectory at Santa Caterina, thus constituting what was likely the largest decorative program made by an early modern woman artist. The lunettes, painted in oil on semicircular wood panels, form a visually cohesive group when displayed with Saints Dominic and Catherine flanking and facing the crucifixion. The leftmost panel in the cycle represents a legend in which Saint Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order, received the first string of rosary beads from an apparition of the Virgin Mary. With her right hand, the Virgin extends to Dominic a string of white rosary beads and 3 roses that comprise the rosary. As is typical for images of Dominic, a star appears in his halo, alluding to a prophetic image received by his godmother following his baptism. Below, a black and white dog holds a flaming stick in its mouth as it looks at Dominic. This refers to a prophetic vision received by his mother during her pregnancy, which foretold that Dominic would set fire to the world with his preaching. In the central lunette, the crucifixion, a lance and sponge-topped staff emerge from the bottom of the painting to flank either side of Christ's body, creating the compositional effect of an inverted triangle. The sun and moon, depicted with human faces, gaze upon Christ from either side of his outstretched arms, referencing the biblical narrative of the moon eclipsing the sun at the time of Christ's death. In the third lunette, Saint Catherine of Siena, the Dominican saint to whom Nelli's convent was dedicated, kneels in prayer with her elbows resting atop a tree stump. The saint's left hand prominently bears the mark of her characteristic stigmata. Catherine looks up towards the sky, where a yellow source of divine light radiates outwards and casts an opaque white sheen over a sky of dark clouds. Little is known about the commission or provenance of the lunettes. However, an unpublished report filed on October 10, 1810, by the commission charged with taking inventories of art in suppressed convents, helps clarify the original location of the lunette cycle. And I'd like to thank Dr. Catherine Turrell-Lupi for generously sharing this with me. In this report, Commissioner Francesco Fantani describes the process of walking through various rooms in the convent and placing seals on artworks to ensure their conservation and relocation upon the convent's closure. Fantani wrote that in the refectory, he found a Last Supper with 3 lunettes above. According to the items listed in inventories from 1810, Nelli's monumental Last Supper and lunette cycle are the only paintings belonging to the convent that fit this description. The Last Supper is Nelli's largest and best-known painting. A work of remarkable scale for an early modern female artist, it measures nearly 7 meters wide and 2 meters high. The result of a collaborative effort between Nelli and her workshop, the painting depicts Christ's final meal, during which he instituted the celebration of the Eucharist. In the top left corner of the composition appears Nelli's signature. It reads, Suor Plautilla, orate pro pictora, or Sister Plautilla, pray for the paintress. The 1810 report indicates that at the time of the convent's closure, Nelli's Dominic, Catherine, and crucifixion lunettes were displayed in the refectory above her Last Supper. Given the infrequent redecoration of Santa Caterina after Nelli's time at the convent, it's reasonable to assume that this had been the painting's arrangement since the 16th century. Giorgio Vasari discussed the Last Supper in his brief biography of Nelli in the 1568 edition of his Lives of the Artist. He did not mention the lunettes, though it's likely that the entire refectory decorative program was commissioned at the same time in the mid-16th century. To appropriately contextualize Nelli's production of these 4 paintings, it's important to review what is known about her artistic education and role in the convent. Camilla Bartolini Rucellai founded the Florentine convent of Santa Caterina da Siena in 1496 at the request of Girolamo Savonarola, who served as the prior of the neighboring male convent of San Marco from 1491 until his public execution in 1498. Throughout the convent's centuries of operation, the friars of San Marco supervised the women of Santa Caterina and administered communion, confession, and punishment to the nuns. Suor Plautilla Nelli, born Polissena Margherita Nelli, took solemn vows at the convent in December of 1538 at age 14. During her early years in the convent, the elder nuns provided Nelli with a scribal and artistic education that focused on manuscript illumination. It's uncertain how Nelli made the transition from small-scale illumination to painting on canvas and panel. However, by the mid-16th century, she established an artistic workshop of unprecedented scale at Santa Caterina. Nelli and her workshop worked on commission for a variety of private and ecclesiastical patrons, while also creating decorations for their own convent. The refectory program at Santa Caterina would have certainly been the nuns' largest project. Each of Nelli's lunettes measure approximately 230 centimeters wide. The total width of the cycle, 698 centimeters, corresponds closely with the Last Supper's width of 671 centimeters. The architectural scales provided on floor plans of the convent indicate that the refectory end wall was approximately 800 centimeters wide, allowing it to accommodate the width of Nelli's paintings. The only existing floor plans of the convent date to the 19th century. On these plans, the refectory can be identified as the long rectangular room situated along the main cloister. The refectory was accessible through a single portal via a smaller lavabo room where the nuns washed their hands and began to observe silence. They would then process into the refectory, where Nelli's Last Supper was displayed on the short end wall above the prioress's table. On this plan, the width of the Last Supper is indicated by the red line on the refectory's end wall. The 3 adjacent black lines indicate the width of the lunettes. The semicircular shape of the lunettes indicates that they were installed under a vaulted ceiling, likely between embedded corbels that divided the upper part of the end wall into 3 bays. 3 sets of floor plans of the building, dating between 1840 to 50, clearly indicate vaulting in the refectory. They also indicate that there was a floor of nun cells above the refectory space, demonstrating a structural need for vaulting. These floor plans were drafted before the 1865 demolition and reconstruction of the convent's original structure, and each depict 3 vaults on the end wall of the refectory. Based on the scale of measurement provided on the plans, the measurements of these vaults correspond to those of the lunettes. The architectural design of Santa Caterina's refectory conforms with the trends of its time. Most nunneries in Florence had vaulted refectories with painted decorations that corresponded to the shape of their end walls. While these other decorative programs were created in fresco by male artists, Nelli painted her program on wooden panels and canvas. In the Renaissance, fresco painting was considered to be a distinctly masculine art form and was not practiced by any women artists. In a method similar to fresco painting, however, Nelli and her workshop painted the Last Supper, which was likely installed slightly above eye level, with great precision. In contrast, they painted the lunettes with broad, sweeping brush strokes. Since the lunettes were hung high on the refectory's end wall, their less precise compositions enhanced their legibility for viewers at ground level. The most significant visual precedent for Nelli's program is Giovanni Antonio Soliani's Supper of St. Dominic. This fresco adorned the end wall of the neighboring San Marco refectory, to which Nelli was likely granted entrance. Above a scene of St. Dominic and his friars being fed by angels, the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist stand to either side of a central crucifixion scene, with St. Antoninus and St. Catherine of Siena kneeling at their sides. Nelli and Soliani both depict kneeling saints flanking and facing the crucifixion, reflecting a Dominican tradition of including these exemplary saints in the refectory space alongside Christ. In its dual-level arrangement, Nelli's refectory program referenced the visual composition of Soliani's fresco while adapting it to the tripartite vault of her refectory. Nelli was known to look to the male artists at San Marco, namely Fra Bartolomeo, as references for several of her own works. Therefore, it's highly plausible that she used Soliani's San Marco fresco as a source of inspiration for her refectory program. Nelli's program conformed to the traditions of early modern monastic refectory decorations, and thus should be considered in the chronology of similar programs by male artists. Many early modern refectory decorative programs, including those at Santa Croce and Santa Apollonia, featured a central crucifixion above a Last Supper scene. Though this composition is seen in both mendicant and monastic refectories, it served a ritual purpose in Dominican refectories, where friars and nuns often paused to venerate the crucifix during their procession into the space. According to the rule book written for the women of Santa Caterina, known as the Direttorio, the nuns would make the sign of the cross before they sat for meals, indicating the appropriateness of crucifixion imagery in their refectory. As Dominicans, the nuns at Santa Caterina were encouraged to model their devotion on the order's great examples, including Catherine of Siena and Dominic. Representations of Dominican saints often appeared in the communal spaces of the order's convents and served as behavioral models for friars and nuns. Nelli was certainly familiar with Fra Angelico's large-scale fresco in the chapter house of San Marco. In this fresco, Angelico depicted a large group of saints, including Dominic and Peter Martyr, at the side of Christ on the cross. The San Marco chapter house was a space for community meetings, which often included the readings of devotional texts. Fra Angelico's fresco allowed friars to meditate on their saintly counterparts as they observed silence during these meetings. In the same manner, the nuns of Santa Caterina would view the images in their refectory frequently and for sustained periods of time. The nuns' rulebook also ordered the women to eat silently as they listened to readings of vernacular devotional texts during meal times. Thus, both Angelico's fresco and Nelli's lunettes combine devotional figures to encourage individual contemplation within Dominican communal spaces. Although the refectory at Santa Caterina was a space meant primarily for dining, it also served as the convent's primary space for punishment. If a nun committed a behavioral offense, including breaking the silence during a meal, she would be punished in the refectory. This punishment often involved nuns taking a meal of bread and water on the refectory floor. Given that the nuns came to the refectory for nourishment, meditation, and discipline, the room's decorative program needed to provide exemplary models for both contemplative diners and disobedient sisters. Christ himself served as the ultimate model for the nuns, who were known to engage in meditative exercises in which they envisioned themselves as part of Christ's passion. A vernacular sacred song written by Savonarola, entitled Laude al Crocifisso, or In Praise of the Crucifix, is recorded in a songbook belonging to the convent. Though it would have been sung by the nuns in their church, the song's call for meditative visualization carried into every aspect of the women's daily lives. The 8th stanza of the song encouraged nuns to engage in the imitation of Christ and imagine themselves on the cross. It reads, "O cross, make a place for me and take my limbs, so that my heart and soul may burn with your holy fire." Its 10th stanza continues in a more contemplative manner, reading, "Let the cross and the crucified be engraved in my heart, and I will always be affixed in glory where he has been." Nelli painted numerous small devotional panels of St. Catherine of Siena meditating on the crucifix while crying, indicating her extensive artistic engagement with these themes. Thus, her crucifixion lunette must have served as a similarly meditative tool for nuns during mealtimes in the refectory. While the crucifixion lunette encouraged contemplation on Christ's sacrifice, the Dominic and Catherine panels depicted exemplary models of Dominican devotion. In the St. Dominic lunette, the order's founder receives the rosary directly from the Virgin Mary. This must have reminded the nuns of Santa Caterina of their own rosary prayers, the Hail Mary and Our Father, which they recited daily. Dominic's closeness to Mary, the holiest woman in the Christian faith, encouraged nuns to seek a similar relationship with the Virgin through prayer. The St. Catherine lunette does not depict a discernible moment in the saint's legend. Rather, it represents Catherine as a Dominican female exemplar. Her intimate relationship with Christ is emphasized through Nelli's depiction of her stigmata and communion with a divine source of light. This would have served as a further reminder to the nuns of the prayerful discipline required to achieve communion with God. Assembled as a cycle, the lunettes work in dialogue with each other, creating a visual call and response. As Dominic receives the rosary, a string of rosary beads hangs from Catherine's belt. The 3 roses in Dominic's panel reference a letter written by Catherine about meditation on Christ's suffering, in which she described the white rose of perfect purity, the red rose of martyrdom, and the vermilion rose of the blood of Christ. Lastly, and perhaps most obviously, Catherine's stigmatic wound corresponds directly with the wounds of Christ in the crucifixion. The lunette cycle provided a meditative counterpart to the Last Supper that concluded the narrative of Christ's passion and depicted Catherine and Dominic, who were considered to be the nuns' singular patron and father. The outdoor setting of the lunettes also contrasts the indoor space of the Last Supper, affording its enclosed viewers a sense of imaginary breathing space within the confined interior of the refectory. As described in the nuns' rulebook, the education of novices at Santa Caterina focused on the instruction of silence, reading in the vernacular, and obedience to their male overseers. The nuns' discipline was tested daily in the convent refectory, which was under the constant watch of friars from San Marco. Through depictions of divine exemplars, the lunettes served as a reminder to the nuns of Santa Caterina of their vows to Christ, their convent, and silent obedience. Never discussed before in scholarly literature, Plautilla Nelli crafted a large-scale decorative program that complemented both the architectural and devotional needs of her convent refectory. Installed on the refectory head wall above the Last Supper, Nelli's lunettes completed what was likely the largest visual program created by an early modern woman artist. The courtly works of formally trained female artists, including Artemisia Gentileschi and Sofonisba Anguissola, dominate recent scholarly conversations on early modern women painters. We must make proper space for Plautilla in these dialogues, as no lay female artist created a decorative program on the scale of Nelli and her workshop of nun painters. In understanding Plautilla Nelli's Lunettes and Last Supper as a cohesive program for her refectory, we can better understand the remarkable scale and ambition of a 16th century nun's artistic pursuits for her own community. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jeanette Alexis Martinez, who will present Giorgio Vasari's Madonna of the Rosary at Santa Maria Novella, the Rosary, the Mantle of Mercy, and the White Scapular. Jeanette.
Giorgio Vasari's altarpiece of the Madonna of the Rosary, located in the Florentine church of Santa Maria Novella, merits greater scholarly attention, as does the majority of the religious art created by this artist. The altarpiece depicts the Virgin Mary, standing on a pedestal in the center of a composition, standing with the Christ child in her right arm, as Saint Dominic kisses her left hand while receiving the white scapular of his Dominican order of preachers. In the lower half of the painting, other figures join Dominic under Mary's blue mantle, which is lifted up by a pair of angels. The upper margins of the altarpiece depicts God the Father and the dove of the Holy Spirit above decorated roundels of the 15 mysteries of the Dominican Rosary. Previous scholarship on Vasari's Madonna of the Rosary has primarily discussed the altarpiece as either an example within a broader survey of this iconographic type, or as part of the Vasarian program of altarpieces commissioned for the 16th century renovation of Santa Maria Novella. Today, I present a deeper contextual approach to explore the Dominican spirituality embedded in the work and provide definitive identifications of some of the altarpiece's protagonists and objects, forming a new iconographic interpretation that was previously absent in scholarly literature. This research argues that Vasari's Madonna of the Rosary blends of visual and textual sources to devise an innovative composition that serves a tripartite function. First, it guides the laity in praying the Rosary. Second, it stresses the Virgin's role as an intercessor by combining the Madonna of the Rosary with the Madonna of Mercy through the Virgin's open mantle. And third, it emphasizes the Dominican order's entrustment to the Virgin through the gift of the white scapular. In a ricordanza that dates from the end of 1569, Vasari documented the completion of this massive altarpiece. The Caponi, a prominent Florentine family, were among those selected for lay patronage of one of the new private family chapels in Santa Maria Novella during Vasari's extensive renovation of the church. According to the ricordanza, Vasari split half of the payment with Jacopo Zucchi, a member of his workshop who executed the painting. The Madonna of the Rosary image type derives from an early 13th century legend of Saint Dominic receiving the Rosary from the Virgin Mary. In the 16th century, the Dominican Rosary was a devotional practice that involved the repetition of prayers, mainly the Hail Mary and Our Father, while meditating upon 15 specific events from the lives of Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary. The word rosary also referred to the beads used to keep track of these recitations. Saint Dominic occupies a central position next to the Virgin, identifiable by his black and white habit along with the white star or red star above his head, which recalls the legend of a light that appeared over him during his baptism. Vasari, following traditional depictions of the Rosary, shows Dominic receiving an object from the Virgin. However, it is not the Rosary as one might expect, which Dominic already possesses in his left hand. Instead, Dominic receives a white cloth from the Virgin. Joining Saint Dominic under the Virgin's mantle are other prominent Dominicans. On the other side of the Virgin is St. Peter Martyr, who holds rosaries in both hands. Following tradition, he is depicted with a bloody gash on his head, recalling his martyrdom by a hatchet. St. Catherine of Siena, dressed in her Dominican black and white habit, holds a crucifix, one of her attributes, in a manner that exhibits the wounds of the stigmata. In the right corner of the painting's foreground is Pope Pius V. A member of the Dominican order, Pope Pius V decreed a papal bull that approved the devotion of the Rosary in 1569, the same year that the altarpiece was completed. Vasari's original design represents one of the first altarpieces of this subject produced after Pope Pius V sanctioned the devotion. Some scholars have erroneously identified this figure. Pope Pius V also commissioned Vasari to paint the Last Judgment for the Church of Santa Croce in his native Bosco Marengo in Piedmont, and this panel also included his portrait. A close comparison of Pope Pius V in the Last Judgment to this figure in the Madonna of the Rosary confirms this identification of Pope Pius V. The upper margin of Vasari's altarpiece depicts rosary beads that intertwine around 15 large roundels, each illustrating one of the 15 mysteries of the Dominican Rosary as it was prayed in the 16th century. Following the Dominican devotion, Vasari groups the mysteries into 3 sets of 5. Using specific colors for the roundels and rosary beads in each of the 3 sets, Vasari distinguishes the joyful mysteries, the sorrowful mysteries, and the glorious mysteries. The joyful mysteries pertain to the early life of Christ, the Annunciation, the Visitation, the Nativity, the presentation at the temple, and Christ among the doctors. These mysteries, which Vasari depicts on blue roundels, linked together by small blue and green beads, begin with the Annunciation on the roundel closest to the Christ child and progress in order towards the upper left corner of the altarpiece. The sorrowful mysteries, depicted on black roundels joined by red beads, prompt meditation upon the suffering and death of Christ. Progressing from the Virgin's left shoulder to the painting's upper right corner, the sorrowful mysteries are the agony in the garden, the scourging at the pillar, the crowning of thorns, the road to Calvary, and the crucifixion. At the top of the altarpiece, the glorious mysteries, painted on gold medallions encircled by gray beads, progress chronologically from left to right, depicting the events following Christ's death. Traditionally, these were the resurrection, ascension, descent of the Holy Spirit, Assumption, and coronation of the Virgin. While the depictions of the mysteries in Vasari's altarpiece align with the widely accepted tradition of praying the Rosary, the 5th glorious mystery warrants a closer look. During the late 15th and early 16th century, it was common for devotees of the Rosary in Venice and in Florence to meditate upon the glory of paradise in place of the coronation of the Virgin. This study examined early copies of Vasari's altarpiece in search of visual clues. Cherubino Alberti's engraving of Vasari's altarpiece is not an exact replica in all its details, but faithfully reproduces all of the mysteries of Vasari's roundels that are legible. Therefore, it is possible that the engraving was faithful to them all. If so, then Vasari depicted the 5th mystery as the glory of paradise, as seen in this engraving. Another Madonna of the Rosary, painted in 1604 for the convent of San Nicolo in Prato, more closely follows Vasari's composition. But unlike Alberti's engraving, the artist clearly painted the 5th glorious mystery as the coronation of the Virgin. These examples demonstrate 2 different possibilities of what Vasari may have depicted for his 5th glorious mystery. Vincenzo Borghini, Counter-Reformation iconographer and Benedictine monk, dedicated many years to developing iconographic schemes for Vasari and likely contributed to the design of the Madonna of the Rosary, along with some of the Dominican friars from the church. In the late 15th and early 16th century, printed Dominican prayer manuals were designed to spread the devotion of the rosary to a broad audience, whether lay or clergy, elite or poor, literate or illiterate, to make information on the devotion as accessible as possible. These portable didactic handbooks helped codify subsequent illustrations of the mysteries in later rosary manuals, including those printed in Italy. In 1521, Alberto da Castello, a Dominican friar in Venice, published a pocketbook manual titled Rosary of the Glorious Virgin Mary, which profoundly influenced the growth of the rosary in Italy and is the closest link to Vasari's altarpiece. Castello's manual, which underwent multiple reprints, consisted of over 400 pages with approximately 190 woodcut illustrations. At the beginning of each set of mysteries, Castello depicted the Virgin at the center of a rose, enclosed by beads with roundels of the 5 meditations. Vasari and the artists that imitated Vasari's Madonna of the Rosary composition followed the visual tradition that had become standardized by the time of Castello's publication. Through art, Dominicans intended for devotees first to learn the 15 mysteries, then be able to recognize the mysteries when looking at works of art, and eventually have all 15 memorized without the need of visual aids due to consistently returning to the same tradition of visual imagery. In following the visual tradition of the mysteries, Vasari's altarpiece is a large didactic tool that aligns with the goals of rosary manuals. In the context of the Counter-Reformation, a period when artists were expected to create religious compositions that clearly instructed the faithful, Vasari's massive altarpiece instructs the laity. Without needing believers to possess a rosary manual, the painting offers the same illustrations found in printed manuals, like that of Castello. Vasari's 3 sets of mysteries, distinguished by the distinct colors of each set of 5 roundels and their interlocking beads, assisted the laity in classifying the mysteries. As beholders encountered the altarpiece, they were encouraged to learn, recognize, and memorize the sequence of religious narratives. In his compositions, Vasari avidly drew inspiration from the works of other artists as a springboard to shape his own creations that fit the context of his commissions. In this altarpiece, the most impactful example of Vasari adapting iconography is his combining of the Madonna of the Rosary image type with the Madonna of Mercy to stress the Virgin's role as an intercessor, the second function of this altarpiece. The Madonna of Mercy served as a devotional Madonna image type of the Virgin, in which she shelters laity from the wrath of God, a message communicated through her open mantle. By examining images of the Madonna of Mercy that Vasari knew, it becomes evident that Vasari created a hybrid of 2 Madonna types for his altarpiece at Santa Maria Novella. At the beginning of his career, Vasari studied under Rosso Fiorentino and owned his drawing of the Madonna of Mercy. This provided Vasari with a prototype for his own compositions. Vasari was also familiar with other renditions of the Madonna of Mercy, as it was a prolific subject in his hometown of Arezzo. In the 1560s, he renovated the Church of the Pieve in Arezzo, where he would have been familiar with another painting of this Madonna type. Here, the Virgin hovers above. 2 angels lift the Virgin's mantle. At the top of the panel, God, flanked by 2 angels, holds arrows associated with his wrath during times of plague, but the arrows will not penetrate those that are under the protection of Mary's cloak. To illustrate the Virgin's open mantle, Vasari similarly painted 2 angels holding the Virgin's cloak for his altarpiece. He also emulated Rosso Fiorentino's depiction of Mary standing on a pedestal with figures crouching around her, underneath her open mantle. For the composition, Vasari also resourcefully drew from his own works. In 1557, Vasari painted a Madonna of Mercy. In this image, 2 angels hold up the Madonna's mantle as she holds the Christ child in her right arm. The open mantle reveals the kneeling figures of two saints joined by a crowd of faithful laity. Vasari selectively borrowed elements to create a Madonna of the Rosary that conveys the protective intercession of the Madonna of Mercy by depicting Mary surrounded by crouching and kneeling figures under her open mantle held by angels. Prior to Pope Pius V's papal bull in 1569, only a few examples of Italian altarpieces of the Madonna of Mercy were created, and none portrayed the Madonna with an open mantle. In combining the Madonna of the Rosary with the Madonna of Mercy, Vasari created an innovative iconography that further communicates the Virgin's protective intercession. This reading of Vasari's Madonna of the Rosary sheds light on a third function of the altarpiece, which emphasizes the Dominican order's entrustment to the Virgin through her gift of the scapular, an important detail that has previously gone unnoticed in literature. While images of the Madonna of the Rosary typically depict Dominic receiving the Rosary, in Vasari's altarpiece, Dominic instead receives a white cloth, the part of the Dominican habit worn on top of friars' shoulders and underneath the black kappa. This panel depicts Saint Dominic flanked by smaller narrative scenes from his life, including the vision of the gift of the scapular in the fourth scene on the left-hand side. Jordan of Saxony, the author of the Order of Preachers, was Dominic's successor and the first to document the legend of how Dominic received the scapular for his order. Ultimately, the legend follows that in 1218 in Paris, Reginald of Orleans met Dominic, who encouraged him to join the Order of Preachers. When Reginald fell seriously ill, thus unable to join, Dominic prayed to Mary for his healing. Mary appeared to Reginald, cured his illness, and bestowed upon him the gift of the white scapular. The scapular was understood to be a creation of the Virgin's love, adding symbolic meaning to the preacher's garment because it was exclusively from the Virgin. The vision of the Dominican habit from the workshop of Fra Angelico represents a slight deviation from Jordan of Saxony's account, as it shows the Virgin directly gifting Dominic the scapular with the black kappa. These two examples demonstrate how images of the legend varied in visual depictions. Like Fra Angelico's workshop panel that illustrates a more direct connection between Dominic and the Virgin, Vasari's altarpiece illustrates the Virgin gifting Dominic the garment. Like Vasari, other artists completely omitted Reginald from their renditions of this legend and depicted Dominic receiving the scapular to portray the founder as having a direct personal relationship with the Virgin. By depicting the Madonna giving Dominic the white scapular, Vasari's altarpiece communicates a message that the order is under the care of the Madonna. In the altarpiece, Dominic kisses the hand of the Madonna as a gesture of gratitude. For the Dominican friars, Mary's gift of the white scapular was regarded as a tender and affectionate pledge of her protection. This scapular was an expression of her provision for the friars because it is she who clothes them. The intended audience of Vasari's Madonna of the Rosary, especially the Dominican friars, would have been familiar with this Dominican legend and thus able to identify the scapular as both a physical and symbolic gift to the order. When designing the Madonna of the Rosary, Giorgio Vasari employed a range of iconographic and textual sources to craft an inventive composition for the altarpiece of the Caponi family and the Dominicans at Santa Maria Novella. His composition functions as a monumental visual aid that was useful to teach the devotion, newly sanctioned by Pope Pius V, as viewers were able to learn, recognize, and memorize the joyful, the sorrowful, and the glorious mysteries. Additionally, the altarpiece blends the Madonna of the Rosary with the Madonna of Mercy, creating a hybrid image that emphasizes Mary's protective intercession to the clergy and laity who pray her rosary. Lastly, consideration of the important Dominican legend regarding the Virgin's gift of the scapular is fundamental for properly identifying the altarpiece's central detail that emphasizes the Dominican order was entrusted to the care of the Virgin. For the 16th century audience of Vasari's altarpiece at Santa Maria Novella, the Virgin's gift of the white scapular contains spiritual implications of her divine protection and intercession. Ultimately, this reading of Vasari's Madonna of the Rosary reveals its profound utility and message for the audience at Santa Maria Novella and its truly innovative design. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Our last speaker is Jessica Lane, who will present St. Mark's Miracles at Pentapolis, New Considerations of Tintoretto's Brea canvas for the Scuola Grande di San Marco in Venice. Jess.
In 1562, the physician Tommaso d'Angone was elected to serve at the highest post of one of Venice's most prestigious lay confraternities, the Scuola Grande di San Marco. In his one-year tenure as Guardian Grande, Rangone single-handedly financed the creation of 3 large canvases by Jacopo Tintoretto to decorate the Scuola's main meeting room, known as the Sala Capitolare. 2 of these canvases display subjects that are easily identifiable from St. Mark's hagiography: the recovery of the body of St. Mark and St. Mark saving the Saracen from a shipwreck. However, scholars have contested the unusual iconography of the 3rd canvas, traditionally known as the finding of the body of St. Mark, now at the Brea in Milan. For centuries, Tintoretto's Brea canvas has impressed and challenged its viewers with its complex iconography. In response to these enduring iconographic questions that date back to the painting's initial reception, some scholars have suggested a new interpretation of the canvas as representing the miracles of St. Mark. I support this identification and will demonstrate for the first time that the foreground depicts St. Mark's miracles in Pentapolis, a region of 5 cities in Libya where the saint performed missionary work. On the far left, St. Mark stands in profile wearing a blue mantle over a red robe. At his feet, a pale, sharply foreshortened corpse lies on an oriental carpet. Next to the body is a portrait of the patron, Tommaso d'Angone, shown in a golden robe as Knight of St. Mark. Immediately behind Rangone and St. Mark, a kneeling man grasps a cane while gesturing towards his eyes, indicating blindness. On the right, a man partially draped in yellow cloth clutches at a man on the ground with him, whose form is almost completely in shadow. Wispy white vapors float from the shadowy figure's mouth and drift towards the barrel vault above, representing the exorcism of a demon from his body. I argue that each of these figures, excluding that of the patron, represent a miracle effected by St. Mark in Pentapolis, the healing of the blind, the raising of the dead, and the exorcism of an evil spirit. However, these miracles are not the only subject of the canvas. Behind the possessed man, known as the demoniac, 2 men stand on ladders to reach inside a tomb and lower down a nude male body head first. A man on the ground wearing a white turban grasps the corpse's arm. Behind them, a man with a candle illuminates the scene. In the setting's final bay, a group of shadowy figures pry open a floor tomb. 2 men kneel at opposite ends of the tomb and reach their arms inside. Tintoretto's first biographer, Carlo Ridolfi, identified this pair as the 9th century Venetian merchants who removed Mark's body from Alexandria and brought his relics to Venice. The background actions thus represent the search process and eventual finding of St. Mark's body in the Alexandrian church. Rangone commissioned the Brea canvas in 1562, and he joined the Scuola as early as 1559. Scuole were lay institutions devoted to their patron saints and functioned primarily as charitable institutions to assist Venice's poor. Despite their philanthropic activities, membership in a Scuola Grande also reflected social prestige among members of the non-governing classes. This social element was reflected in their decoration, as they sought out elaborate commissions from Venice's most important artists. By 1566, the Brea canvas was installed to the left of the Sala Capitolare's main entrance. The recovery of the body of St. Mark and St. Mark saving the Saracen were both placed on the doorway's right. This large room was used for meetings and the celebration of Mass, during both of which these works were visible. The confusion around the iconography of the Brea canvas reflects the fact that none of the painting's miracles appear in the standard hagiographies of St. Mark, such as Jacopo di Voragine's 13th century Golden Legend. Scholars often consider them to be unrelated miracles that lack textual sources or an overarching connecting narrative. However, St. Mark's miracles in Pentapolis, as described in 3 key hagiographic works, correspond directly with the miracles of the Brea canvas. The first source is a Venetian liturgical manuscript from San Marco, referred to as the Legendario. It dates from the 12th century and recounts the life, martyrdom, and miracles of St. Mark. Several 16th century marginal notations made in the manuscript confirm that it was in active use during Tintoretto's lifetime. The story of St. Mark's miracles at Pentapolis, as recorded in the Legendario, matches Tintoretto's iconography almost exactly. The text states that St. Mark came to Libya, in Marmarica, and finally in the region of Pentapolis. He healed the infirm, raised the dead, and exorcised evil spirits. The Legendario was a central component of the divine office celebrated at San Marco, which canons would read aloud each morning and evening for the majority of the 16th century. Additionally, hagiographic texts on St. Mark, such as the Legendario, were read aloud publicly on the saint's feast day. This painting represents one of the city's many processional celebrations on St. Mark's feast day. The Venetian liturgical calendar also dedicated 3 additional holidays to St. Mark. Thus, the Legendario was likely part of the ceremonial liturgy several times a year. The rulebook of the Scuola Grande di San Marco required its members to attend St. Mark's feast day Mass in the Basilica, where they would have heard the Pentapolis story read aloud from the Legendario. Bernardo Giustiniani also discusses Mark's miracles at Pentapolis. His text on the life of St. Mark, the De Divi Marci Evangeliste, was first published in 1493 and continued to be reprinted throughout the 16th century. An edition from 1534 described Mark's miracles in Pentapolis. St. Mark went to Pentapolis. He healed the sick, drove out demons, restored eyesight to the blind. Like the Legendario, Giustiniani's miracles match nearly exactly with the Brea canvas. His text did not include the raising of the dead, which Tintoretto depicted. However, Giustiniani's specific description of the healing of the blind features prominently in the painting, represented in the figure directly behind Rangone and St. Mark. The miracles at Pentapolis were important enough in the Venetian tradition that they were repeated in the 17th century, as in Giovanni Stringa's 1610 Vita di San Marco. Stringa's positions as a canon and later master of ceremonies in San Marco gave him extensive knowledge of St. Mark's hagiography and liturgy. He wrote that St. Mark departed on his voyage in Pentapolis, a region in Libya. He raised the dead, exorcised demons, restored sight to the blind, again corresponding directly with the miracles shown by Tintoretto. These 3 texts reveal that the miracles depicted in the Brea canvas are not merely a composite of acts, nor a series of 3 unrelated miracles, but instead represent an important episode in Martian hagiography, which would have been understood by Tintoretto's viewers in the Scuola. The Basilica of San Marco was also an important site for visual precedents, representing various aspects of St. Mark's mission to Pentapolis. The vault mosaics in the St. Peter Chapel and the Zen Chapel in San Marco, which date from the 12th and 13th centuries, illustrate different aspects of St. Mark's mission to Pentapolis. The 12th century vault of the St. Peter Chapel shows Mark preaching and baptizing in Pentapolis. Experts agree that the placement of these scenes within the chronology of Mark's life narratively positions them as representing Mark's mission to Libya. The Legendario specifically mentions St. Mark preaching and baptizing as part of his mission to Pentapolis, writing that St. Mark began to preach the gospel, the ineffable incarnation of the Virgin, the saving sacrifice of the Passion, the glory of the resurrection of Jesus Christ our Lord. He explained to them the sacrament of baptism given by the Holy Spirit for the forgiveness of sin. The chapel was one of the most important within San Marco, as it is positioned immediately to the left of the high altar. The inclusion of episodes from St. Mark's mission to Pentapolis within the chapel demonstrate that it was a recognized part of the Venetian iconography of St. Mark that dates back to the Middle Ages. Scenes from Pentapolis also appear within the 13th century Zen chapel vault mosaics depicting the life of St. Mark. The lower register of the eastern half shows St. Mark healing a demoniac. Its subject matter and placement in the cycle suggests that the scene takes place in Pentapolis. Although compositionally the Zen mosaic is very different from the corresponding depiction in Tintoretto's canvas, and it includes only one miracle instead of several, the depiction of St. Mark healing a demoniac at Pentapolis is an important visual precedent for Tintoretto's work. The Brea canvas's most immediate visual precedent, Jacopo Sansovino's 1537 bronze relief panel, St. Mark healing a demoniac, was also made for San Marco. The bronze panel, along with several others on the life of St. Mark, was installed just above eye level into the marble structure of the South Singers Tribune. Sansovino's terracotta model of the scene provides a clearer image of the panel's iconography and details, although the head of St. Mark is now missing. Both in composition and subject matter, scholars have widely noted the similarities between Sansovino's 1537 relief and Tintoretto's 1566 painting. St. Mark is shown gesturing in benediction at the center of the scene. He's surrounded by crowds of the ill and infirm, best represented in this seated figure on the right. A motionless body lies at the saint's feet. In the center of the image, a man kneels on the ground as a leaping demon leaves his body. Sansovino described the panel in his own account book as St. Mark expelling demons, healing the lame, and raising the dead. Although scholars have suggested that this panel represents St. Mark's missionary work in Alexandria, I argue instead that the similarities of Sansovino's description to the hagiographic text discussed here suggest that it represents St. Mark's miracles at Pentapolis. Sansovino's iconography was likely prescribed to him by the procurators of San Marco on the basis of these texts. Procurators of San Marco, like those Tintoretto shows here, were elected government officials and occupied the second highest office below the Doge. One of their main duties was to oversee the upkeep of San Marco. In particular, the artistic decoration of San Marco was the direct responsibility of the procurators since the inception of their office in the 12th century. The procurators' involvement in the creation of Sansovino's reliefs is well documented. Sansovino displayed their terracotta models to the procurators for their approval prior to casting, including this one, the model for St. Mark healing a demoniac. Sansovino also submitted his account book, which I mentioned earlier, directly to the procurators, further demonstrating their involvement in its commission and iconography. While Sansovino was likely given his iconography by the procurators, the situation was more complicated for Tintoretto's commission. At the Scuola Grandi di San Marco, the decision to represent the Pentapolis miracles may have been suggested by the artist himself, the patron Rangone, or the Scuola's resident artistic advisory board, the Provveditori sopra la fabbrica. This advisory board was made up of 5 Scuola members, likely included in this group portrait here, who oversaw all artistic and architectural endeavors within the Scuola, and who gave the ultimate approval to the Scuola's artistic commissions. Significantly, on the same day that Rangone commissioned the painting, he also joined the artistic advisory board, suggesting that he played an important role in deciding and approving the painting's subject matter. Thus, it's likely that the subject of the Brea canvas likely came from Rangone and Tintoretto themselves, with later approval given by the Scuola. artists had a high degree of freedom in their commissions for Venice's Scuole Grandi. For example, in 1491, documents record that the subject of Gentile and Giovanni Bellini's canvases for the smaller room known as the Albergo in San Marco, shown here, were to be chosen directly by the artists themselves. Tintoretto's 1562 commission for the Scuola Grande most likely followed this tradition, in which Scuola artists had a high degree of artistic freedom and worked in close collaboration with the patron and artistic advisory board to choose a suitable subject. Tintoretto was likely interested in the Pentapolis iconography because of Sansovino's relief panel. We saw earlier how the Brea canvas's subject matter and composition were a direct reference to Sansovino's earlier relief of the same subject. However, this was not the first time that Tintoretto directly quoted Sansovino for his work in the Sala Capitolare of the Scuola Grande di San Marco. Tintoretto's 1548 painting, shown at right, also made for the Scuola, was a direct reference to a different earlier bronze relief by Sansovino. Again, the two are remarkably similar, both in subject and composition. When Mangone commissioned the new works in 1562, it was a prime opportunity for Tintoretto to continue referencing Sansovino's reliefs within this room. Tintoretto's repeated quotations from Sansovino's sculpture was likely fueled by a sense of competition between the two artists. Art writer Pietro Aretino even went so far as to characterize Tintoretto's use of Sansovino's iconography as the combat of pitting one virtuoso against another, and said that Tintoretto is near the winning post of the race. This sense of competition between Tintoretto and Sansovino, remarked upon even by their contemporaries and mutual friends, was not unusual. Documents like this letter and accounts from Tintoretto's early biographers emphasize the sense of competition that Tintoretto felt compared to the giants of Venetian painting, like Titian and Veronese. Within this context, it is even more probable that Tintoretto chose the San Marco relief panel featuring Mark's miracles at Pentapolis for the Brea canvas in order to compete with Sansovino. Since its commission in 1562, the Brea canvas has sparked interest, admiration, and debate, particularly when it comes to its complex iconography. The identification of the painting's background scenes as the search for and the finding of the body of St. Mark has been relatively stable throughout the painting's critical history. This secure identification has led many scholars to interpret these events as the painting's main subject matter. In doing so, they have often ignored or misinterpreted the miracles in the foreground. Since these miracles do not occur in the standard Martian hagiographies, like the finding of the body does, they are often dismissed or overlooked entirely in discussions of the painting's subject. By identifying the scene's miracles as representing St. Mark's mission to Pentapolis, this study sheds new light on the foreground as a specific and cohesive narrative episode in Martian hagiography. Venetian texts on the life of St. Mark establish the legend of his miracles in Pentapolis as part of the saint's official local hagiography. The representation of the Pentapolis miracles within the mosaics and the choir reliefs in San Marco reveals further knowledge of the subject and confirms its representation in important decorative cycles on the saint's life, which date back to the Middle Ages. This identification also has implications for the study of Jacopo Sansovino's bronze relief sculpture, which has generally been interpreted as representing St. Mark in Alexandria. Through connecting Sansovino's account of the relief with textual sources on the Pentapolis legend, this study presents a new contribution to both the work of Tintoretto and Sansovino. Thank you.
And if I could invite Jeanette and Alden to come up to the front with her. We've now heard 3 extraordinary papers on the lunettes by Plautilla Nelli, on an altarpiece by Giorgio Vasari, and on a painting by Tintoretto. And you now have an opportunity to ask the experts if you have a question or would like to hear a little bit more about some aspect of their presentations.
I don't know, I haven't noticed this before, but Alden, I have a question for you that also stems from looking at Jeanette's presentation. Why do you think Plautilla Nelli dressed Dominic and Catherine in white when very typically the Dominican habit is black and white? And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking maybe it gives added, it kind of singles them out in those upper images, but do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is something that I gave quite a bit of thought to in my research. The question is about why Catherine and Dominic aren't wearing this black kappa over their white habit. It's not typical for imagery of Catherine and Dominic, as we see also in Jeanette's image. I think a lot of it does have to do with the visual cohesion, especially since the lunettes were hung so high. By putting both of these saints just in their white habit, you could see them more clearly. But also, I think because each of the moments depicted are private moments in the saints' lives, perhaps if Catherine is meditating in the outdoors and Dominic is receiving this vision alone outside, the idea is that they're dressed more casually for that. Thank you.
Elizabeth, I was wondering if I could ask you a question about, you mentioned that Plautilla Nelli would have seen the Fra Angelico, and I was just wondering about how she or how the sisters might have been getting access to these male spaces.
Certainly. So this question is about Nelli's access to the male convent of San Marco. San Marco and Santa Caterina had a very close relationship. They were both founded by, San Marco was not founded by Savonarola, but he was, a very popular figure there in the prior, and he's the one who wanted Santa Caterina to be founded as the sister convent. And so I think the women probably would have been able to enter the space because the men were working with them every day. They were their overseers and were giving communion, punishment, all sorts of things to the nuns. And because Plautilla had such an established artistic workshop at San Marco, I think that it's probable that the men there respected her for that and would have let her enter their convent to see the works there. We also know that she inherited the drawings of Fra Bartolomeo directly from his student, Fra Paolino. So that established working relationship goes pretty deep. And so I think it's quite plausible to imagine that she was entering these spaces at San Marco. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jessica, the three paintings of San Marco, the two in the Accademia and the one that you spoke of, where were they? If they were for the Scuola Grande di San Rocco. I mean, where were they? I mean, I'm trying to think of some space in San Rocco where these three big paintings are. Did I not get that?
Sure. So the question on the original location of the three works commissioned by Rangone. So these were actually made for the Scuola Grande di San Marco, not San Rocco. So there were 6 Scuole Grandi in Venice. In San Marco was, the scuola where Rangone was the guardian grande. So he commissioned them for this space. And they originally were located in the Sala Capitolare of the scuola. So this would be the scuola's main meeting room. They flanked the main entrance to this space. So visitors would see them not as they entered, but once they were established inside. The room was finished with an altar, actually also by Jacopo Sansovino. It included Tintoretto's 1548 Miracle of the Slave and was finished in the 1590s with paintings by Domenico Tintoretto. So this would have been used for confraternity-wide meetings with many members and also the celebration of Mass, because since there was that consecrated altar in this space, they could celebrate Mass there. So when you enter San Marco, which is now part of the hospital complex, you go kind of from the ground level and then you go up towards the primo piano, what Americans would call the second floor, to this main room, which also had a smaller doorway of which you can go to the albergo, which I also mentioned.
And why was this the only painting that left Venice?
Yes, so this painting, exactly. So you're correct that the Brea canvas is the only one of these 3 that has left Venice, and it was dismantled again during the Napoleonic suppression. So, that is the kind of origin story for its leaving Venice. Thank you. Exactly, yes. Yes, good thing it remained in Italy. I agree. Thank you.
I have a question for Jeanette. I was wondering if you could, I was really interested in your analysis of the images in this hybridic Madonna. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that, and if this is something that you saw as a wider cultural approach to the image of the Madonna.
Yes. So what really intrigued me about this Madonna of the Rosary was that it's not only the Madonna, but it also has the mysteries. And so I took a look at Vasari and what he does for not only this composition, but his other works. So it was very common for him to recycle or reuse or repurpose different iconography and also look at other artists and then build something that was his own. And so there were a lot of Madonna of the Rosary altarpieces first coming out of Germany and France, and that's where we see the first Rosary manuals. But in Italy, it just took some time for those manuals to reach here and then for altarpieces to come about. And so Vasari was the first one to embed this Madonna of the Rosary with the Madonna of Mercy. And he also used his own works and his own, made a prototype, I guess, to build his composition.
Okay, well, if I could invite our first three speakers, Lydia and Sarah and Emma, to come to the front of the room. 6 young scholars that you have just heard fine presentation deliveries from have essentially, except for a couple of papers and assignments and paintings to finish, completed the degree requirements for their MA. And so we would like to present them with a token of our appreciation and celebrate their achievement. We are very proud of you. And I invite you to join me in applauding them. Okay, professori.